Martin van Breda was a very successful businessman who decided to move his family from Melbourne, Australia, back to his native country of South Africa, and he did so with some reservations. You see, in Australia, Martin and his family thrived, and Martin recently retired from his position as managing director of the international real estate firm called Engel and Volkers. This was a tough decision for Martin and his family because at the time, South Africa still had socio-economic problems, and there were some other problems too. For one, Martin's son Rudy, who was 22, and Henry, who was 20, were currently at university. And Marley, his daughter, was also settled in at school. But it seemed like their birthplace was just an irresistible force, especially for Martin and Martin's wife Teresa, because she missed her family so much and she just wanted to be close with them. And I think we all know that's what really probably inspired the move. So Martin and his family leave from Tullamarine Airport in January 2014 and landed in Cape Town the next day. They would be joined by Rudy and Henry a few months later at the end of their semesters in university. Martin was not naive and was aware of the problems of his home country, especially the very high crime rate. So Martin wanted to mitigate these risks at least as best as he could, so he followed the same path as many other wealthy South Africans by buying a home in a gated community, and in this case it was the exclusive Delzals Golf Estate in the gorgeous environs of Stellenbosch, which is the center of the country's wine industry. Now, this place was marketed as a medium security estate, but that, in my opinion, is a huge understatement. This complex was surrounded by an electric fence, plus it also had 24-hour armed guards, and the entrance access always was controlled. Plus, the individual units themselves were very sophisticated with alarm systems and motion detectors. Now, even though there were all these precautions, it still offered no protection from within. And in the early morning hours of January 27th, 2015, a horrible violence came crashing upon them. Now, this all started with a phone call that was made at 7:45 a.m. by Henry, and he appeared very agitated, and with good reason. He was reporting that his family had just been attacked by an axe-wielding intruder, so police and paramedics, they raced to the scene, walked in on the scene, and what they saw they never could have anticipated. It was an absolute bloodbath of unprecedented scale. So they walk in, and first they see Teresa, who was dead, and her corpse was lying at the top of the stairs, with her features barely recognizable because her injuries, along with all the blood that was engulfed all over her, she was just unrecognizable. Then there was Martin, who was deceased as well, and he was hacked to death in the master bedroom. Also, his son Rudy laid beside him and was deceased as well, but from the way the wounds were on Martin's back, it appeared that he tried to shield and protect Rudy when he was being killed. And then there was Marley, the 16-year-old daughter, and she was attacked, and judging by her defensive wounds on her arms, she put up quite a fight. And she put up quite a fight for her life and suffered tremendous injuries, but miraculously was still breathing. So she was rushed to Tygerberg Hospital and was taken directly into surgery. And the good thing is, she would eventually recover from her injuries, but it would be a long and painful journey. And to top things off, she suffered retrograde amnesia and therefore could not tell the police what happened on that horrific night. Lastly, there was Henry. He got very lucky and suffered only a superficial wound to his torso in the attack. And according to Henry, He woke up in the middle of the night to sounds of a struggle, and he went to investigate, which is when he encountered a knife-wielding man who he described as black and dressed in dark clothing, wearing gloves and a balaclava. He said that the two of them tussled for a little bit, and at that point Henry was stabbed in the process, but then the man suddenly broke off from the confrontation and fled away. And at that point, Henry went through the house and he found his parents and his siblings either dead or severely injured. Now, right from the start, Henry's story raised several questions. Chief among those was how the intruder was able to sneak past security to enter the complex in the first place. And then, how did he get inside Martin's residence when there was no sign of forced entry? Plus, then, there was the issue of motive. If this was a robbery gone wrong, why did the criminal bypass the whole lower floor and go directly upstairs to attack the sleeping family? It made no sense. So, even at the early stages of the investigation, detectives suspected that Henry was not telling them the truth, or at least the whole truth. So the detectives started looking into Henry's background and made some damaging discoveries. It seemed that Henry was the black sheep of the family, where his brothers and sister excelled academically. Henry preferred to party, and he actually just dropped out of university. Plus, he had a drug habit and was hooked on a very addictive narcotic known as tick. Plus, recently, Martin had sent him to a very expensive rehabilitation center in Belleville. Now, that cost to Martin was a lot, and it did very little for Henry because he soon left the facility and was using drugs again. And with a bunch of series of small incidents that followed, it made Martin threaten to cut off Henry's allowance and to actually fully write him out of the will. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm starting to smell a motive. Maybe Henry killed his family over the dispute with his father, or more likely he killed them because he feared losing his considerable inheritance. And even though this was possible, the investigators were having a tough time seeing this fact because the crime that was committed with such savagery. And even though Henry had problems, he was still a well-spoken young man. So I don't know if the detectives didn't want to believe it, but either way, they had a hard time wrapping their head around that Henry could be the killer. And it is sad to say that family murders are regrettably an all too common feature of this modern life that we all live in. But you gotta understand, this went way beyond murder. This was savagery and butchery. There was literally so much blood that spilled that one paramedic was moved to say that the staircase looked like a waterfall of blood just flowing down it. So even though the detectives did not want to believe it, the police ended up then flagging Henry as their prime suspect. And after this, evidence quickly began to pile up against him. For starters, there were the murder weapons, which were an axe and a kitchen knife, both found at the scene of the crime. And these had not been brought from outside, but they belonged to the Martin family. And then there was Henry's odd behavior in the immediate aftermath of the murders. Plus, the medical examiner set the time of death for the victims around 4 a.m. that morning. And at 4:42 a.m., Henry made a series of phone calls to his girlfriend, which all of them went unanswered. After that, Henry carried out several internet searches trying to find a number for emergency services. However, he did not phone them immediately. He waited a full 3 hours before making the call. And this is exactly what he said on the call.
My family and me were attacked by a guy with an axe.
just like that. It was very suspicious the way he said it, and a little more detail, a little more emotion would have been appropriate. So I guess a question would be, what was Henry doing during those 3 hours that were unaccounted for? And according to Henry, he was so traumatized by discovering his family brutally murdered that he fell into a dead faint, and that he had been out cold for all 3 hours until he became conscious, woke up, and then immediately called police. But this explanation did not gel with the investigators. They actually believed that there was a far more sinister explanation for the delay. They believed that Henry wanted to be sure that his victims were dead before he made the call, so he let them slowly bleed out. Then we move forward to June 13th, 2016. 18 months after the murders, when prosecutors called Henry's lawyer and advised her that her client should hand himself over to police ASAP or face imminent arrest. So the following day, Henry was arraigned at the Stellenbosch Magistrates Court on 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. So Henry denied the charges and was released on bail of 100,000 rand. He would remain at large until April 4th, 2017, when his murder trial began at the Cape Town Supreme Court. Henry was advised by his lawyer not to take the stand, but he decided to anyway, which would prove to be a very, very bad decision for him. So despite his continual denials, Henry did not look like a sympathetic figure. He remained chillingly devoid of all emotion and described his mother bleeding to death on top of the staircase, and every word that he spoke was delivered in a matter-of-fact way and tone, which was very heavy on details but lacking any sense of emotion, considering this man just suffered a terrible tragedy. And by the time that he stepped down from the witness stand, there were only a rare few in that courtroom that doubted he did it. Most of them believed they just heard chilling lies by nothing other than a psychopathic killer. And there certainly was no doubt for how Judge Suraj Desai saw it. South Africa does not have a jury system like we do in the United States, so it was up to the judge to decide whether Henry was guilty or innocent. And on May 21st, 2018, he delivered his verdict. Henry was guilty of 3 counts of murder and guilty of 1 count of attempted murder and guilty of defeating the ends of justice. Henry was subsequently sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 27 years on top. The black sheep of Martin's family will spend the rest of his life running with a flock of his own choosing. On September 2nd, 1999, in the suburban town of Jericho, New York, which was just 30 miles from downtown Manhattan, Ronald Cohen was preparing to sell his house, and he just found a buyer for the property for $455,000. And the new owner wanted to take a final walkthrough before taking ownership. This buyer was particularly very thorough, and during the walkthrough, he wanted to see the crawl space beneath, which was an addition that was built onto the back of the house about 30 years ago. The crawl space was only 36 inches high, so the 2 men had to hunch down to get through the larger space. And at the very back of the crawl space, they noticed a 55-gallon barrel on its side wedged beneath the stairs. And this is when the buyer asked Mr. Cohen about the barrel, and Mr. Cohen said it's been there since he bought the property over 10 years ago. Mr. Cohen said he had absolutely no idea what was in there, and it was far too heavy to move by himself, so he ended up, just leaving it there. And after that, it just slipped out of his mind, and he ended up totally forgetting about it. This is when the buyer said he wanted it removed before he would purchase the property. So Mr. Cohen and his real estate agent got some help and rolled out the barrel from underneath the home and then took it to the curb so the trash workers could haul it away. But when the sanitation workers showed up the next day, they informed Mr. Cohen that the barrel weighed over 355 pounds and was way too heavy for them to take away, especially since they had no idea what was in it. And it needed to be emptied to make sure that there was no hazardous material or toxic materials inside. So Mr. Cohen and his real estate agent decided, okay, fair enough, and they opened up the barrel. Well, at least they tried to open it up. There was a metal seal around the top of the barrel, so they had to get some tools, and they ended up prying it open. And after that, the two men immediately were hit with this overwhelmingly horrible smell, and it was the unmistakable smell of death. Once the lid was removed, they could see a curled human hand and a woman's shoe, plus the barrel was filled with a green fluid surrounded by these tiny plastic pellets. And at this point, Mr. Cohen immediately called the police. So the police, they rushed to the scene and immediately took the barrel to the forensics lab, where they emptied it onto a large white tarp so they could collect any evidence. And inside the barrel, they found a small mummified female body. Now, the body had been crumpled over and bent in half so it could fit into the barrel. And because the barrel was sealed so tightly, her body had been fairly well preserved, with the skin the same as the consistency as rubber at that point. But when it hit the air, it began decaying quickly, and it was immediately taken away for an autopsy. During the autopsy, it was determined that the body was a female of Hispanic descent, and that she was very small, only about 4'9", and she had long black hair along with some unusual gold bridge work on her teeth. And the bridge work was not something commonly done in the United States at that time, and had most likely been done in South America somewhere. The cause of death was determined to be from blunt force trauma to the head. Someone literally used a hammer to smash her head 7 to 10 times, crushing her skull until she died. And to make things worse, it was also found that she was either 8 or 9 months pregnant when she died. So police collected DNA from the fetus to see if they could find a match to the father. And when the police emptied out the rest of the barrel, they found this strange green gooey liquid that they thought was possibly a chemical dye of some sort. And they also noticed a tiny black and white plastic bunch of pellets mixed with this goo, and the woman's clothes were still intact as well, and it seemed to be from a style from the 60s. Then, at the bottom of the barrel, they found the woman's purse, along with some cosmetic items, along with a badly damaged address book, and there was also a green stem from a plastic flower arrangement that was very strange. So, upon looking at the address book, it was badly damaged, and most of it stuck together with the green goo, and the detectives at first weren't hopeful of getting any clues from it, but just in case, it was put inside a forensic dyeing cabinet for a few days to dry out. So after that following day, detectives began researching to find out where the barrel may have came from. And then the homeowner, Mr. Cohen, explained that it was already there when he bought the house several years ago, and detectives began going back through the prior owners to find out who built that extension on the house. And after they researched 4 prior owners, they eventually found the one homeowner who built the extension to the home, and he was now 71 years old and lived in Boca Raton, Florida. His name was Howard Elkins, and he sold the house back in 1972 and retired when he closed his plastics business that he owned in Manhattan. Police, at this point, they definitely think they got a suspect and immediately wanted to question him. But before they did, they wanted to collect a little bit more information before making the trip south. And as the days went on, the clues started to pour in. On the side of the barrel, there were letters that printed GAF, which turned out to be a chemical company based in New Jersey. Police then took photos of the barrel and brought some of the pellets and a sample of the green dye for them to analyze at GAF, and they confirmed that the pellets were polyethylene pellets and they were used to make many plastic products. One of these products was plastic flowers. And when it came to the green dye, it was a unique product called halogen green, which was a dye specifically used to make plastic flower bases in the 1960s. And the only customer they had for that product was a company called Melrose Plastics. And it was the same company that Howard Elkins had closed in 1972. Meanwhile, the forensics document lab made some progress on the damaged address book. They dried it out enough to at least a point where they could get, the pages separated. But the ink at this point completely disintegrated from the pages. But using a device called a video spectral comparator, they were able to read some of the information on the documents by using alternative light sources. The first portion that they were able to read in the book was a number that started with the letter A, and it was a resident alien number. So detectives spoke with immigration officers, but the number was from over 30 years ago, and their systems had changed at this point. So they let them know that it's going to take some time if they come back with any result at all. So now knowing that the barrel, the plastics, and the dye all came from Howard Elkins' business, and that they found the barrel beneath Elkins' former home, detectives now believe they had enough information to take a trip to Florida and question him. But before questioning him, they wanted to visit his former business partner in the plastic flower business, whose name was Melvin Gantman, and he also retired to Boca Raton, Florida. Mr. Gantman confirmed that he and Mr. Elkins were business partners, but that he had not spoken to him in years. And when they showed him a photo of this barrel, Gantman quickly did confirm that the barrel was one that they often used for their company. Plus, he also verified the dye color and plastic pellets were what they used in making their plastic flowers. And then, when shown the photo of the plastic stem found in the barrel, he knew it was from their company as well. Now, the most useful information Gantman had was something he recalled from back in the late 60s when he knew that Elkins was having an affair with a Hispanic employee at the company and that he rented an apartment for her. Now, he didn't know her name, but he remembered that she had strange gold teeth in the front and long black hair. Gantman also recalled getting a phone call from the landlord of the apartment that Elkins was renting for her. And the landlord was looking for Elkins so he could empty out the apartment and all the belongings because they were still in the apartment. And the landlord did this because he wanted to get things moving so he could rent it out again. And as of now, the detectives were more than ever convinced that 71-year-old Elkins was indeed the killer. and they went to his home, and Elkins answered the door, invited them in, and all the things that Gantman easily remembered from the business, Elkins didn't seem to remember at all. He had no recollection of the barrel, the dye, the plastic pellets, nothing. Surprisingly, when he was asked if he had an affair during that time, he freely admitted that he did. And all he could say was that it was a very short affair, and then she left, and when asked if he knew if she was pregnant or if he even knew her name, he seemed to not remember anything about her at all. Now, obviously, to the detectives, this seemed very convenient for him to have such a lapse in memory. But this is when detectives informed him that the girl was found pregnant and deceased in a barrel beneath his former house, and Elkins at this point seemed completely unfazed. And when they asked for a sample of his DNA, he looked at them, shook his head, and just said no. And just as he said no, his phone rang, and it was his wife. And after speaking briefly to his wife, Elkins told the detectives that they needed to leave immediately. He said his wife was coming home and that they needed to talk about a lot of things. And the New York detectives technically had no jurisdiction in Florida to get a warrant or to make an arrest, but before they left, they did inform Elkins that they would be back with a warrant and put him in jail for the rest of his life. Then, the following morning, the two detectives received a call from the local Palm Beach Police Department, and Elkins was nowhere to be found because his wife had put out a missing persons report. So friends, family, and the police were all out searching for Howard Elkins, and he was later found that evening in his neighbor's garage in the back seat of their Ford Explorer. That morning, he had gone to Walmart and purchased a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun, and Elkins sat in the back seat of that SUV, and he put the shotgun right between his legs and put the barrel of the shotgun in his mouth and found whatever courage he had left in him to pull the trigger, and he shot himself in the head. Now, at this point, there wasn't any question of his guilt, but detectives collected his DNA from the scene and took it back to New York, where it was confirmed that he was the father of the fetus, which, no pun intended, was the nail in his coffin. And as soon as they returned to New York, 8 days after the barrel was found, they got word back from immigration with the identity of the victim. And her name was Reina Angelica Marroquin. And she had immigrated to the United States in 1966 from El Salvador. The forensic document team was also able to get more information from that address book that they recovered. And they recovered several names, addresses, and phone numbers. And the phone numbers were over 30 years old. So detectives, they didn't have much hope for them, but they tried calling anyway. And amazingly, one number still worked. And the woman that answered was named Kathy Andrade. She was actually a really close friend of Reina and was still living at the exact same location 3 decades later. Kathy identified Reina from a 30-year-old immigration photo and said that Reina immigrated from El Salvador and worked making plastic flowers at Melrose Plastics in the 60s. If this crime was a puzzle, it seems like every piece was beginning to fit, from who the victim was to who the killer was, along with the circumstances that allowed all this to happen. And then in November 1968, Reina had told Kathy that she had been dating her boss at the flower factory and that she was indeed pregnant with his child. Kathy didn't know his name, only that it was Raina's boss at the flower factory. And one day, Raina told Kathy that she made a terrible mistake and said that she had gotten really mad at him and called Elkins' wife. And Raina told his wife that her husband was having an affair with her and had promised to marry her instead, and that she was pregnant with his baby. And at this point, Raina told Kathy that she was absolutely terrified that he would kill her. And it turns out that her assumption was absolutely correct. And that was the last time Kathy ever heard from Raina. Kathy did going to Raina's apartment one afternoon where there were plates set out for dinner, and the dinner was still warm on the stove, but there was no sign of Raina. So she called the police at that time to report her as missing, but was told that she wasn't a family member, so she couldn't file a missing persons report. So she tried to call Raina every day for weeks after that, but never heard from her and eventually just gave up. Now, Oscar Coral, who was a journalist covering this story for Newsday, a daily newspaper in New York City, tracked down Raina's 95-year-old mother in San Salvador, El Salvador, and flew down to visit her. Her mother said she would speak and write on a regular basis and talk on the phone with Raina when suddenly, out of nowhere, all the contacts stopped and she had absolutely no idea why. Now, this is a really crazy part. She said she would often dream of Raina trapped inside a barrel. And at this point, when I read this story, my whole body literally got chills, as I'm sure yours is probably doing the same right now. I mean, there really is something about a mother's intuition that is otherworldly. So, to sum things up, Raina's body was transported back to El Salvador to be buried, and her mother ended up dying 1 month later and was able to be buried right next to her beloved daughter, Raina. On August 5th, 2009, the Peoria Fire Department received a call that smoke was coming from the Covenant of Grace Church. Now, Peoria is just west of Phoenix, Arizona in Maricopa County. You know, it's a quiet city and quite beautiful. However, in 2009, it became the starting point to an investigation that, according to detectives, would uncover one of the most vicious, hideous murder cases in the history of Phoenix. Now, there was this white man who was 46-year-old Terry Neely, and he was riding around in this motorized wheelchair when he approached a 33-year-old African-American woman named Angela Simpson. And she was outside of her West Phoenix apartment smoking a cigarette on August 2nd, 2009. Angela, at that time, barely knew who Terry was. All she knew was that he lived nearby at an assisted living center. And during the conversation, Terry was boasting about how he was actually a police informant, PI, and further indicated how he snitched on someone who Angela knew. And it was someone that she felt was a good and righteous person. Now, in Angela's mind, there were only two types of people that she believed deserved to be killed. And one of those two types of people were child molesters, okay? And the other one was police informants. So she viewed Terry as nothing but white trash and a horrible person for becoming a police informant. Now, Angela used a little bit of her charm and invited Terry over to her apartment to get intimate and to do other things like drugs. And of course, Terry was excited for this offer and followed Angela Simpson as she led him to her apartment, which was apartment number 201. And once they were in the apartment, Angela stood in front of Terry and very slowly approached him. Now, at this point, Terry thought they were about to get intimate, and he could not take his eyes off of her, and he was in anticipation of the future events that were about to happen. But when she stood directly in front of him, Angela gave him a hard slap right across the face. Now, at this point, Terry just yelled out in pain as he was knocked to the side in his wheelchair. And at this point, Angela moved behind the wheelchair and pushed Terry until he was in front of a wall-length mirror. And she did this because she wanted him to witness everything she was about to do to him. Now, from here, Angela grabbed a tire iron from her room and repeatedly beat him over the head until the blood was flowing down from his head and he began to lose consciousness. And that's when Angela spotted some pliers on the kitchen table. So she grabbed them and demanded Terry, who was almost unconscious at this point, to open his mouth. But Terry could not comply because from all the blows to the head, it left him dazed and confused, just withering in pain. So she grabbed his head and forced it back, and then with her other hand, she pulled out his teeth with pliers one by one as Terry just screamed in pain in tremendous horror. So at this point, his head was still soaked in blood, and now there was even more blood dripping from his toothless mouth. And at this point, he was barely alive, and he slipped down from his wheelchair onto the floor. And then from the same table where the pliers were, there was also a hammer and a 3-inch nail. So Angela grabbed the hammer and nail and drove the nail into Terry's skull as he moaned in excruciating pain. And then the blood from his mouth wounds drained down into his throat, causing him to cough up blood. Now, at this point, you could imagine that Terry just wanted to get out alive, and he had enough. But that didn't stop Angela from grabbing an electric cord and wrapping it around his neck and choking him. Now, we're at the point where Terry is lying on the floor, barely alive, and I'm sure he just wanted to do nothing but leave and never come back to where this awful woman lived. But he would not get the chance to leave because while laying down, Angela finished him off by slicing his throat and stabbing his body repeatedly. So after killing him, Angela stood over his dead body that was soaked in blood, and she was faced with a problem on now what to do with the body. And she realized at that moment she was not going to be able to move it alone. So she did something that you probably saw in a movie before, and she grabbed an electric saw and dismembered the body. Now, Angela's adrenaline at this point allowed her to completely remove Terry's torso, and then she threw it in a garbage bag after that, and then she placed it in her car and drove to the Covenant of Grace Church. And just before she arrived, she placed the bag in a trash can in the parking lot there. Then she poured lighter fluid on the bag and lit it up. It ignited. And this, as you can imagine, is when Terry's torso became engulfed in flames. And Angela just got back in her car, and then she sped away from the scene. So right after this, firefighters were alerted of this fire, and they immediately went to put it out, and as they did, they discovered Terry's torso. So the police were called, and detectives immediately started to investigate. And a little later on, they found Terry's electric wheelchair outside a West Phoenix apartment, and detectives at this point could not establish a connection between the torso and the wheelchair, nor did they have any leads at this point. But the detectives caught a huge break in the case when Angela Simpson was arrested for armed robbery that she committed in the same month that she murdered Terry. So the police went to her apartment to search for more evidence, and upon entering, they discovered that it was all cleared out. But all that remained was this very strong smell of bleach. So this is when the police were able to find blood evidence that matched the DNA of the torso that was caught on fire. And when confronted with this information, Angela immediately, without remorse, confessed to murdering Terry. and she was sentenced to prison for life with an additional 14 years for abandoning a body. Now, Angela has been very open about her feelings regarding her crimes since her conviction. And when she was asked about murdering Terry, she said, "I don't want my children or the people I consider to be family to be in a place where there are snitches. I mean, I believe informants and child molesters should be killed." And as shocking as this is, she also told interviewers that she did not feel any guilt at all for killing Terry. And then she stated, "I'm a little upset that I won't be able to, kill more snitches, but, I have no remorse about killing Terry." Then later on in an interview, she was asked why she had him facing the mirror during his murder. And that's when she simply stated he needed to see what he deserved. And Angela did not seem to be bothered by prison, because when she was asked about how she felt about now having to spend the rest of her life in prison, she replied, "I got a lot of family in prison, so I'm okay with that, I've got many sisters in prison, and I can't wait to see them, and it's really not that much of a punishment to be sentenced to spend the rest of your life with your family." I know. Kind of crazy, right? Yeah. But later on, Angela Simpson explained that she had a history of mental illness going back to just when she was 10 years old, but insisted to everybody that she did not want or expect their sympathy. She certainly doesn't have mine. She also said she believed she deserved the death penalty, but is happy with her life sentence instead. Finally, when asked if she would ever kill again, she replied, without hesitation, "If the opportunity arises, I sure hope so." Now, I believe this story brings that old expression, "snitches get stitches," to a whole new level. Thank you for listening to this story. I will be uploading stories 2 to 3 times every week, and also uploading shorts. So please, if you enjoyed this, just take a moment to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Share this to everybody you know. At least share it to 1 or 2 people, a family member, a friend. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.